Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Bob Barnes. I cover the Supreme Court for the Washington Post, and I'll be the moderator for today. Think of me as the Chief Justice, just an umpire who calls balls and strikes, but I won't even be calling the balls and strikes. I'll just try to facilitate our discussion today and call on you to ask questions after our speakers finish with their opening remarks. We have a very good, and I'm sure it will be lively, panel. And you have the speakers' bios in your packet there, and so I am not going to go through all of their accomplishments, but I'll just remind you that we'll be hearing from Gail Heriot, who is a professor of law at the University of San Diego, and also a member of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. Has been on that for quite a while and has written extensively on these issues. From Diana Furchtgott-Roth, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, and an economist. I never argue with economists. I don't even know how to do that. And from Laura Kaufman, who's the Senior Counsel and Director of Education Policy for at-risk students at the National Women's Law Center. Her interests in these issues is obvious, I think, by her title. And so, without further ado, please welcome Gail Heriot.
Let's talk about sex, ladies and gentlemen. We all know that sex causes people to do irrational things, but it also seems to make for irrationality in public policy, the subject of this panel. To be sure, no area of public policy has ever been completely dominated by clear-eyed thinking. And many cases that have no connection to sex, like Ferguson, are neck-deep in misinformation. Still, the kind of moral panics that periodically grip the nation in connection with sex may be in a special category, from the white slavery scare of the early 20th century to the rash accusations of rape culture on campuses today. Facts don't always seem to matter. For example, by now almost everyone knows the lurid truth about the military, or at least they think they do. Last year, after a survey showed that sexual assault against servicewomen was rising dramatically, newspapers breathlessly called it an epidemic. The New York Times blamed the rise on, quote, the military's entrenched culture of sexual violence, close quote. Well, no wonder Congress feverishly pursued legislation to deal with this scandal, including a proposal for a top-to-bottom overhaul of the military's criminal justice system, proposed by Senator Gillibrand. Her plan was essentially to dismantle the military's criminal justice system, which has developed over hundreds of years to fit the unique situation of the military, and to replace it with something that's a lot more like the civilian system. All this driven by the perceived failure of the military to deal with sexual assault. But there is just one problem. Precious little of this story of rampant sexual assault had any basis in fact. Contrary to what many assume, evidence that the military has a higher rate of sexual assault than other institutions like colleges and universities that have lots of young adults, evidence just isn't there. Indeed, what evidence there is suggests just the opposite. Nor was there good evidence that the problem was increasing. To the contrary, a sober read of the evidence shows that it was decreasing. That doesn't excuse bad behavior, of which there is always plenty to go around, but it does provide much needed perspective. So let's lay out some facts here. First, the questionnaire at issue asked about what the military delicately calls unwanted sexual contact, not about sexual assault, a much more loaded term. Such contact can range from a provocative pat on the bottom to forcible rape. Lawmakers who argue that high rates of unwanted sexual contact can harm the military's morale and recruitment efforts are dead right, but their own overwrought reaction can be just as harmful. false messages of an entrenched culture of sexual violence hurt the recruitment of women. Prosecuting men who have not committed any crime hurts the recruitment of men. And making the military sound like a haven for sociopaths instead of the honorable calling that it is hurts recruitment generally. The military has been surveying its active duty members on unwanted sexual contact repeatedly since 1988. Overall, these surveys have shown impressive improvement. Sometimes the improvement has been astonishing, like that reported in the survey in 2010, which showed a 35% drop in the rate of unwanted sexual contact reported by servicewomen since the previous survey. The 2010 survey was probably too good to be true. Bear in mind that even expertly crafted surveys sometimes produce inaccurate results. If so, it was inevitable that the results in the 2012 survey, right after it, would look bad in comparison, even though the 2012 results were still a 10% improvement over the next previous results. Interestingly, when you ask servicewomen, do you think sexual harassment is more of a problem inside the military or more of a problem outside the military? The majority, 54%, say it's the same. And more say the problem is worse outside, 28%, than say it's worse inside, only 17%. Critics often assume the military fails to provide sexual assault training or that it's lax in the prosecution of these crimes relative to civilian jurisdictions. But the opposite appears to be true. As for training, 96% of the women and 97% of the men reported on the 2012 survey that they had received sexual assault training in the last 12 months. The fact is that sexual assault and sexual harassment training have been a way of life for the military for the last 2 decades. Prosecution rate comparisons are very difficult since civilian jurisdictions are not required to publish statistics. But insofar as there is evidence, it suggests the military is now 4 times more likely to prosecute a sexual assault than a civilian jurisdiction is for the same range of sexual assaults. It's not just defendants and their attorneys who are complaining about over-prosecution at this point. It's the prosecutors, too. One female prosecutor who wished to remain anonymous commented to McClatchy newspapers. She said, quote, "There's pressure to prosecute, prosecute, prosecute." She went on to warn that over-prosecution can lead to cynicism. As she put it, when you get one that's actually real, there's a lot of skepticism. You hear it routinely. Is this a rape case or is it a Navy rape case? One thing's for certain here, and that is the military's top brass are now desperate to placate Congress. Last year, a supplicating Army Chief of Staff, General Raymond Odierno, said before the Senate Armed Services Committee that, quote, "Combating sexual assault and sexual harassment within the ranks is our #1 priority." The military can have a lot of priorities, but only one can be #1. If combating sexual assault and harassment is the military's #1 priority, that means coming up with a strategy to deal with ISIS and other threats to our national security is not. It's time to sober up on this one. But let me take another example. Sexual assault and harassment on campus. As of last week, the Department of Education had 76 open investigations into colleges and universities, including some of the largest and most prestigious, for tolerating sexual violence and harassment. The claim is that by failing to vigorously punish students who committed sexual assault or harassment, the schools are engaging in sex discrimination in violation of Title IX, since women are more likely to be the victims than men. As a result, they can have their federal funding pulled. An elaborate 2011 guidance letter from the Department of Education requires schools to take immediate action to eliminate any hostile environment, prevent its recurrence, and address its effects. Schools are, in effect, required to create an elaborate bureaucracy to deal with the threat of unwanted sexual contact or harassment. All this is said to be necessary on account of an epidemic of sexual violence on campuses. Indeed, if you believe what you hear, 1/5 to 1/4 of all female college students will be the victim of actual or attempted rape while in college. Alas, you cannot believe everything that you hear. I don't have time to critique all the highly inflated empirical studies on this subject. Let me just stick to one of the most cited among them, the cost study, which found that during a 12-month period, 16.6% of all college women had been the victims of rape or attempted rape. Of course, 73% of these women did not agree that they had been raped, and about 40% of them had sexual intercourse with their so-called assailant after the incident. Contrast that with the sexual victimization of college women study that was funded by the Department of Justice in 2000. It found only 1.7% of women who had responded had been raped in the past school year. Of those, almost half did not use that term, did not consider themselves to have been the victim of rape. Rather, that was the spin put on it by the researchers. But even that, close to 1% per year would be a pretty high rate of rape. But if you're thinking of stranger rape when you hear it, and some of you might be, that's probably the wrong thing to think about. These are mostly date rape cases, some of which are indeed clear-cut, non-consensual sex, which must be taken very, very, very seriously. But some of them are not, and some of them are fraught with moral ambiguities. I note that one of the major risk factors for this kind of rape was found by the researchers to be intoxication. Unfortunately, the media have little interest in questioning inflated numbers. A headline that says rape culture rampant in colleges is much better clickbait than campus dating scene full of ambiguities. So you've probably heard some of the stories in connection with the Department of Education's investigation. One case, Swarthmore, is being investigated in part because it failed to punish a male student who had been having consensual sexual intercourse with the alleged victim for several months, but they had agreed to break up. She nevertheless allowed him to sleep in her bed, and she crawled into bed with him. He evidently took this to mean, one last time, for the good times. And she initially says that she rebuffed him, but when he tried again, she figured that she would just let him have his way and get it over with. She then waited a month and a half to complain of the rape and was upset not to be taken seriously. There is forcible rape that occurs on campuses, the kind that can only be responded to with a felony conviction, and it is probably more common to find it there than you will find in institutions that are not dominated by young adults. But there are also lots of miscommunications by people that are just learning how to deal with the opposite sex on that basis. A lot of mistakes are made. Fear-mongering on this is not a good idea for anyone, including women. In conclusion, I have sort of two thoughts that both of them I think are connected generally to the topic of grandparents. I have one very general comment on grandparents and another very specific one. The general one is that the people of my grandparents' generation had a solution to this problem. They thought that indeed it was true that there were a lot of situations where people are getting hurt on campus on account of often misunderstandings. And their solution to that problem was not haul out the felony accusations. Rather, their solution was to head it off at the pass, prevent it from happening. Have a dormitory where students have a curfew by 10 o'clock, that male students can't come into the female dormitories except on Sundays between noon and 3, and the door to the room had to be open and 2 feet had to be on the floor at all times. And when I was in college, I thought that was utterly asinine. maybe in view of all the disagreements we have now, they weren't so stupid after all. And maybe some schools might want to do that. That's up to them. What I'm against is the Department of Education mandating that basically all schools handle the problem the same way. The other point I had that I file under the topic of grandparents is actually a very specific story dealing with my grandmother, who was a very talented woman who was born and grew up during the period of the white slavery scare, when people were being told that young women that moved to big cities were being snatched off the street willy-nilly and being forced into prostitution. And a lot of people believed it, including her parents, unfortunately. My grandmother was applied and admitted to Radcliffe College, then the sister school of Harvard, and she very much wanted to go. But in the end, her parents told her she couldn't go. It was too dangerous. You never know what could happen in the big city of Cambridge, Massachusetts. She never forgot it. To her, people who overestimate the dangers, they are not heroes. They are the reason that she had to stay on the farm and spent the rest of her life milking cows. I would submit that this sort of thing is not something that women benefit from.
Thank you, Gail. As you see, we're going to have to draw Gail out because she's really, not going to be out there unless you encourage her, okay? Next, we're going to hear from Diana, who I'll remind you is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming and thank you so much for listening. And I want to thank the Federalist Society for setting this up. I am not a lawyer, so I'm especially grateful that you have allowed me to speak today. Well, imagine if there were some Martians that came down to the United States and saw that there were two groups. There were men and there were women. And one of these groups had a 5-year longer life expectancy and had 58% of BAs and 63% of MAs and about 52% of PhDs. And that one group had fewer in jail and fewer on drugs. And then the Martians were told that these women, because it's the women who have these advantages, are the ones who are discriminated against. They are the ones that need government help. These Martians would be very puzzled. They would say, life is better on Mars. Things make more sense on Mars. Well, one reason that people talk about women being discriminated against is the wage gap, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. Using census data, Lara has assured me, women make 77 cents on the dollar. Using Bureau of Labor Statistics data, the one that I'm more familiar with, women make about 81 cents on a man's dollar. And these statistics are used to justify bills such as the Paycheck Fairness Act, more government interference. But the wage gap really is not the 81 or 77 cents number. Because what that does is it compares all women who are working with all men who are working, and that's how you get this wage gap. What makes more sense is to look at men and women in the same occupation who've had the same number of years at work, who have the same job, the same education, and then you have to ask yourself, what is that wage gap? And when you make those comparisons, most studies come out with women earning about 95 cents on a man's dollar. The other 5 cents might be discrimination. It might be something economists can't measure. But I would like to argue that it is not a serious social problem. If you look at other wage gaps, such as the White House, President Obama talks a lot about the 77-cent wage gap, how we need to get rid of it. Well, in his White House, it's 87 cents on the dollar. Women make 87 cents on a man's dollar. And when you ask the press office at the White House why this is, they explain, well, this is just because there are more men in leadership positions. Well, it's often the same in workplaces, and there are really 3 major differences for the overall wage gap. First of all, in school, women choose different majors. More of them major in the humanities, more of them major in subjects such as English and gender studies, and there are more men who major in engineering and math and science. When men and women graduate from college, they choose different jobs. 30% or fewer women are in computer science and engineering, partly because of the majors that they've chosen. There are more men who work on Wall Street. There are more women who choose to be social workers. Then a third difference is the hours worked. Once men and women choose these jobs, full-time for women, on average, is 10% less than full-time for men. Women, on average, there are about 24 women who historically work full-time, work part-time. 24% of women, and it's sometimes 25%, sometimes 26%, but about a quarter of women work part-time. And that lowers wages too, because if you work part-time and then you move back into full-time, often you have missing experience, and so you don't make as much. Now, as one illustration, and most of you are lawyers, I would suggest that you look at the website of Yale Law Women. If you look at that website, and I would suggest that the women who go to Yale Law School are some of the smartest young women in the country in order to be able to get into that law school. Every year, Yale Law Women picks 10 firms that they consider to be the top firms. Now, these are not the top firms in terms of pay, the top firms in terms of advancement. They pick the top family-friendly firms. These are the firms that have important, and I'm quoting, important family friendliness indicators, such as part-time, flex time, parental leave, and childcare. Now, if you want to work at one of those firms and you want part-time, flex time, childcare, parental leave, and you start out your career as a lawyer looking for these attributes in a law firm, you're less likely to get paid more than if you start out by looking at family-unfriendly firms, where you have to work 80-hour weeks. And it's a sad fact that family-unfriendly pays more than family-friendly. That's one reason that male-dominated occupations, such as mining, logging, oil drilling, construction, they pay more because they are less pleasant and they are more dangerous. Well, the wage gap would not matter very much if it wasn't used as an excuse for many different kinds of policies that end up hurting the economy and also hurting women. One example of this is the Paycheck Fairness Act. The Paycheck Fairness Act failed to pass a Democratic Congress in 2009 and 2010, even though there was a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president, because it would do so much harm to the economy. But it still hasn't prevented President Obama from calling for its passage, and it's sponsored by Senator Mikulski in the Senate and Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro in the House. What it would do is it would allow the government to collect data from all employers on the makeup of their employees, race, sex, and pay. Employers would only be allowed to justify differences in salary on the grounds of relevance to the job. So they couldn't pay somebody, for example, with an MA more than with someone with a BA, or someone with more experience more than someone with less experience if it wasn't directly related to their job. So the government could argue that being a manager of a supermarket, for example, you don't need an MA, so that extra training is not relevant. Workers would have to opt out of class action suits. They would be automatically opted in. Right now, it's the reverse. You have to opt in, which is a big payoff to trial lawyers. So any of you who are planning on being trial lawyers, this would be very good for you. Now, employers, if they are accused of discrimination, they pay back pay. This way, they would be liable for punitive damages. So this kind of bill would discourage employers from locating in the United States. It would be difficult for them to expand hiring. Each additional hire would be a liability. This would hurt women. It would hurt men it would be the kind of bill that I think would be only in the United States, not in other countries. There are other kinds of policies, too, that the wage gap calls for. People who say there's a wage gap often want employers to provide more kinds of services for women. Mandatory sick leave, paid maternity leave, paid childcare. There's all this group of benefits that Europeans have, they say, that we lack. Why, they say, is the United States the only country without paid maternity leave? Well, these are arranged on a person-to-person basis. We see that because of these different kinds of compensation arrangements, women and men in the United States have more take-home pay. Taxes can be lower. And we find a higher proportion of women working in the United States than in many of these European countries that have all these benefits. Mandated benefits come with a cost. Economists are fond of saying there is no such thing as a free lunch. I don't know if that's true because lunch was served earlier and I could have had a free lunch if I'd wanted. But certainly all these benefits come with a cost. They come with lower cash compensation and higher taxes, so you don't get as much take-home pay. So with that, I'd just like to conclude. I'd like to agree with Gail that what you read is not always what is true. It goes for the pay gap as well as for sexual harassment and sexual assaults. And I'm looking forward to hearing from Lara, who's going to provide us with another point of view.
Thanks again. I'll remind you that Lara is the Senior Counsel and Director of Educational Policy for at-risk students at the National Women's Law Center. Diana, while you and I are not lawyers, Lara is, and I saw her taking a lot of notes. So I'm sure she has something to say.
I do. Thank you, Bob, and thank you, everyone, for your time and attention today. I appreciate being included in this conversation. Glad that you all are interested in hearing another point of view, because I fundamentally disagree with much of what was said before I stood up. I do think we're all going to have a few minutes for rebuttal, and so I'm going to start with just what I prepared to present to you today, and see if I still have time after that to address some of the points that were made, or if I'm able to in the course of my remarks, I will. So I want to start with the wage gap, since that's what we just heard, and I take issue with the way that Diana and scholars like her interpret the data. At the National Women's Law Center, we rely on the same figure that you hear President Obama cite, the 77 cents on the dollar figure. That's the figure that the Census Bureau uses. And what that means is that in 2012, the typical American woman who worked full-time year-round was paid only 77 cents for every dollar paid to men who worked full-time year-round. That figure is the median earnings of women as a percentage of the median earnings of men working the same amount of time, full-time year-round. The 77-cent figure is the best figure to use because it reflects the many barriers to fair pay that women in our society face. It reflects the fact that women and men in the same jobs do not earn the same amount. Women are often paid less for the same jobs as men, often based on the outdated assumption that women are not the breadwinners and therefore don't need the same salary that men need to support their families. Women are also segregated into lower paying jobs than men. The typically female-dominated fields are fields like child care providers, nursing home workers, home health aides, whereas male-dominated fields from which women are often excluded are higher paying, like electricians, police officers, architects, and engineers. That figure also reflects that women are discriminated against based on their caregiving responsibilities. And I will get into some data in a moment which show that mothers earn less than fathers, and women who are married and have children earn less than women who are unmarried and don't have children. And it also takes into account the lack of workplace policies that allow workers to care for their families without suffering a very stiff economic penalty. So the other reason we use that 77% figure is because it allows us to compare and track over time how the wage gap has changed. There are comparable figures available going back to 1960, before the Equal Pay Act was enacted. The wage gap is also far higher than 23 cents for women of color who face both sex discrimination and race discrimination. African American women make only 64 cents for every dollar that white non-Hispanic men make, and Hispanic women make only 54 cents. Asian American women were paid only 87 cents for every dollar paid to white non-Hispanic men during that same period. So the reason we compare to white non-Hispanic men are because those men are not facing the barriers of sexism and racism that women of color are facing. And just to give you an idea of how this adds up over time, these kind of gaps for African American women, for example, resulted in a loss of over $18,000 for African American women and over $23,000 for Hispanic women in 1 year alone, in 2011. Over the course of a woman's lifetime, the wage gap adds up. So for a typical woman who works full-time year-round, over 40 years, she would lose $443,000 due to the wage gap and would have to work 12 years longer than a man in her position to make up that gap. And for African American women, of course, because the wage gap is larger, you have an even larger gap at the end of her lifetime, $746,000. So we're not talking about nothing here. This is very significant and very much affects not only women, but their families. The wage gap occurs at all education levels. Even when you control for education, there's still a wage gap. And I think that these statistics are particularly interesting. African American women in these various professions, I will give you the wage gaps. So women, African American women working as physicians and surgeons, typically very male-dominated and high-paid, make 52 cents for every dollar paid to their white non-Hispanic male counterparts. African American women who work as customer service representatives make 79 cents on the dollar. African American women working as construction laborers make 86 cents on the dollar, and African American women working as personal care aides make 85 cents for the dollar. Any wage gap is unacceptable. Even if we're just talking about a few cents on the dollar, that adds up to hundreds of thousands of dollars over a woman's career. And today, women are nearly 50% of the labor force and are 40% of primary breadwinners, and still they have to make do with less. Now, I want to address something that was mentioned earlier. The wage gap does not exist because of the occupational choices women make. That argument ignores two important facts. One, that women are paid less even when they work in the same occupations as men, as I just demonstrated. And two, that jobs dominated by women are often paid less precisely because they're female-dominated, because women's work tends to be devalued, like childcare and teaching. And there are also reported cases of company-wide pay discrimination, which show that it's not just about the occupational choices women make. But we also need to consider that the occupational choices women make themselves are the product of discrimination. Women are underrepresented, as I mentioned, in higher paying jobs, and that's not just because they would rather not get their hands dirty or do those jobs, but often because they experience barriers to getting education and training in those fields, that they are harassed or discouraged from participating in those fields. They're outright excluded in some instances. And so writing off the wage gap as just a result of women's choices really does not take into account the reality of women's lives in the workplace. Labor economists have conducted studies controlling for factors like occupational choices, industry, work experience, and other factors, and had still concluded that 41% of the wage gap remains unexplained. And that 41% of the wage gap, it could be attributable to a number of factors, as Diana said, but discrimination certainly is one of them. Another factor that has an impact on the wage gap, as I mentioned earlier, is the role that women play as primary caregivers in our society, and workplace discrimination against women who have caregiving responsibilities. A Cornell study sent fake resumes to hundreds of employers. They were identical except for a line in the resume, in some of the resumes, about the applicant being a member of the PTA, the Parent Teacher Association. And when employers compared these equally qualified female candidates, the women who were mothers were perceived as less competent and were less likely to be recommended for hire, or they were recommended for hire at significantly lower starting salaries than women who were not mothers. Interestingly, the effect for fathers was the opposite. Fathers were recommended for significantly higher pay and were perceived as more committed to their jobs than non-fathers. So there is a larger wage gap. Larger than the overall wage gap is the wage gap between parents. Among full-time workers, mothers earn only 69% of what fathers earn. And women without children who are unmarried earn 96 cents for every dollar a man earns, while married mothers earn only 76 cents for every dollar a man earns. And these differences persist even after controlling for factors like the hours people work, the types of job they choose, and the salaries of their spouses. And this is a study based on Bureau of Labor Statistics data from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. The conclusion of the University of Massachusetts researchers who conducted this study was that the majority of the gap is because of discrimination and our cultural bias against mothers. So there was a New York Times article a few days ago about this, that what these data show is that in America we still have cultural ambiguity, if you will, about gender and work. And employers expect mothers to be less productive when they become mothers, and they expect fathers to work harder. But again, today, 71% of women who have children at home work, and women are primary breadwinners in 40% of households with children. So we need policies that convey that people have a right to coordinate work and family. And I'm not going to take time now to get into the different policies that were referred to, but I would maintain that the Paycheck Fairness Act is not bad for business. And there are other policies like child care, like support for working women, like combating pregnancy discrimination and discrimination against caregivers that are critical to the success of women in our society and the success of their children and families. Briefly, to touch on campus sexual assault, because I'm probably almost out of time, 1 in 5 women are sexually assaulted while in college. And I know that Professor Harriet takes issue with the study that relies on, but to suggest that all of the statistics out there are overinflated and that there's actually not a problem of sexual assaults on campus is frankly insulting. And I think this is one area where it's impossible for emotion not to become part of the debate. We're talking about people's lives, and we're talking about really traumatic experiences that not only that have a significant impact on a student's education. And I don't want to get into back and forth about the exact statistics, but it's happening far too often on college campuses. It is very underreported. Most students do not feel comfortable reporting it because of the consequences and because their schools are not responsive. And there's no denying that the emotional and physical effects of these crimes can be devastating to students. So victims of such conduct find it difficult to study, stop participating in school or school activities, and some even take their own lives. There have also been studies done about the responses of schools. Just to touch briefly on military sexual assault, I did not come today with statistics about that, but I know that there are lots and lots of stories of women in Iraq who are afraid to go to the bathroom at night because they might be sexually assaulted on the way to the bathroom. I know that the Department of Defense has been very proactive about assessing the policies and training and procedures And I can speak to the military service academies briefly. Every 2 years, the academies conduct an anonymous voluntary survey of all cadets and midshipmen, and that covers a range of issues related to sexual harassment and sexual assault. So it explores whether they've experienced unwanted sexual contact, their level of understanding of the procedures for reporting sexual assault, whether they participated in prevention programs, how effective they think they were, et cetera. And in response to the survey for the year 2011-2012, approximately 525 students at military service academies reported experiencing some form of sexual assault that year. But the number of sexual assault reports through the official military service academy process was only 80. So there's a huge problem. It's happening a lot more than reports would suggest, and it is the responsibility of schools to ensure that students have equal educational experiences and that their sex is not, that sex discrimination, which sexual harassment and sexual assault are, does not get in the way of their education. That is a federal civil right, and schools have to take action, so.
I want to thank all three of you for such strong presentations and so different. And we're now going to have a lightning round of rebuttal, 3 minutes per person, and then we'll get into some questions and hear from you as well. Gail, will you start us?
Do you want me to get up first?
It's up to you.
Let me just stay down here then. One thing I wanted to point out is this notion on the wage gap, and I hate to step on outside my jurisdiction here, but there's this one fact that I think is interesting, and that is what you hear is that these are comparisons on full-time jobs, and they are. But a full-time job is defined as 35 hours or more. And if you actually break it down, what you find is men actually work a lot more hours than women do. And when you make the comparison of just 35 hours to 39.9 or whatever, and 35 to 40, the wage gap pretty much disappears. In fact, I may be wrong on this, but I think it actually inverts, that women actually who work 35 to 40 hours make more than men who work 35 up to 40 hours. But the point is here, a lot of what's being measured here is number of hours, and when they compare full-time work to full-time work, don't be fooled into believing that you're talking about people who are working the same number of hours. You aren't. You are looking at very different numbers of hours, and women, particularly mothers, sometimes want to work fewer hours. I mean, that makes perfect sense. And fathers, more so than single men, non-fathers, want to work lots of hours because they want to have the money to be able to finance their children's education and such. So that's one point I wanted to make. On sexual assault, again, we're using the wrong term here. What the military tests for is unwanted sexual contact. I've been flipping through a document here and I wasn't able to find the number yet, but when you ask military women and service academy women, why didn't you report this? The answer is frequently, it wasn't very important. It wasn't a big deal. Things like, gee, I got slapped on the bottom. Should I go to the principal? No. That's all I have on my list right now.
Okay, Diana?
Well, first of all, I should say that sex discrimination does happen, but we have methods to deal with it under existing law. We have the Civil Rights Act, the Equal Pay Act, the Lilly Ledbetter Act that was the first law that President Obama signed. So I'm not saying that sex discrimination doesn't happen. I'm just saying it does not happen systematically. And it was interesting what Lara said, that single women are paid 95 cents on a man's dollar. Married women with children are paid 79 cents on the dollar. Well, what it shows is that when women have children, they want to take time to look after them. They want one of these family-friendly jobs that Yale Law School women talk about on their website. Similarly, the statistic that Asians make 87 cents on the dollar, whereas African-American women make in the low 60s. Asians typically Asian women have more education than average. They tend to go into the science and the STEM fields, and so their wages are a product of that. What's really interesting is when Lara says, well, women are strong, they should be paid, they should be paid more, but then she says that no, they're encouraged by society to go into lower wage fields. Well, you can't have it both ways, Lara. I mean, either women are strong and they know their own minds and they're smart enough to choose the field that they want, or they are not, and they're pushed into these other fields. They don't know their own minds, and they're not smart enough to make, a dollar on a man's dollar. You can't really have it both ways. As to the sexual assault data, so the 20% of women assaulted on campus comes from a study from the Centers for Disease Control. And what they did was they asked about experiences. They asked about women's experiences. But the women didn't decide whether they had been assaulted or not. It was the survey respondent didn't decide. It was the people who were administering the survey said, on the basis of what you have said, I will decide whether you have been sexually assaulted or not sexually assaulted. These data dramatically contradict data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which you can get looking at the Justice Department website, which has a far lower rate of about 3 or 4% of women being raped. And the problem is, as many young people have explained to me, is the drinking on campus leads people to do things that they don't want to do or they don't remember afterwards. This isn't a problem of someone jumping on you from behind the bushes and forcibly attacking you. And drinking on campus and over-drinking on campus is a very serious problem, and we should think about what to do about it. I mean, my suggestion is to lower the drinking age to 16 or 17, so people have a habit of drinking in the home, and they don't all of a sudden think, once they get to college, they have to drink as much as they can. And they have to drink as much as they can when they're 18 or 19 because they know that they can't legally drink in public. So they drink a lot in their rooms and in private. I mean, we need to have more of the kind of institution where social drinking is, in small quantities, is encouraged, and binge drinking does not, there isn't so much need for binge drinking. So those are my rebuttal comments.
Great, thank you. Laura?
Thank you. I want to respond to a couple of things. The idea that women are somehow not smart if they end up pushed into traditionally female fields, it doesn't make sense to me, so I'm not sure how to respond to it, but I found it extremely disturbing. I think it's very possible that women could be capable of doing the same jobs as men, and many women do those same jobs as men. Not enough women, but many, and at the same time, the vast majority of women do not get those same opportunities. I don't think those things are inconsistent, and we know that the different occupations that women hold is part of the wage gap. The fact that women are concentrated in lower paying fields and men are dominate the higher paying fields does account for some of the wage gap, and I'm not denying that at all. What I'm saying is that that's not all of it, and that the fact that women are concentrated in those fields itself represents some discrimination, some historical exclusion of women from those fields, some discouragement of women from studying in particular fields, women who are isolated and are the only student, for example, in an engineering class and are harassed may not decide to go into engineering, and I've heard lots of stories like this. So that's one thing. The other thing is, the sexual assault, one thing I wanted to respond to earlier was about military sexual assault, and the point was made that there's no evidence that sexual assault in the military is at any higher a rate than outside the military. And to that, I say, so what? I think that we should hold our military to a higher standard, and that the women who choose to serve our nation and put their lives at risk for our nation should not have to be afraid not only of what happens from the enemy, but also from people in their own ranks. And I think our military can set an example for other institutions in our society because we do take it so seriously, and it is such a important function they serve. And I also don't think that the military can't have more than one priority. I know that the quote you made was that it was the #1 priority, but I think realistically that may be the #1 priority in terms of intra-military relations, but it's probably not the #1 strategic priority. But I still think it's important because encouraging women to serve in our military and enabling them to serve without being attacked is a huge deal. Sexual assault on campus, there's lots of victim blaming that goes on, that women drink too much and make poor choices, that guys drink too much and just sort of lose control of themselves. What we do know is that most assaults are conducted by repeat offenders. So I don't think it's a situation where a guy is just getting drunk and can't tell that she's saying no and is acting irresponsibly that way. I think that there's a lot more to it, and I think the culture of drinking on our campuses should be addressed, and I'm all in favor of lowering the drinking age, but I also think there is a culture that is deeply embedded in our society that doesn't respect consent. And when we talk about forcible rape versus unwanted sexual contact, I think we're nitpicking. I think we're talking about people being touched in ways they don't want to be touched, and that that shouldn't be happening, drinking or no drinking.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask a few questions and more to have them continue their debate, and then I will open up the floor for you folks to do the same thing. And Gail, let me ask you, because I had the same thought that Lara did when you were talking about the military, shouldn't this be a place where we do demand more than we would in the civilian world, and especially with women who have decided that they want to serve their country?
I actually agree that the military should be able to expect more from their members. But that's a far cry from let's overhaul the entire criminal justice system of the military and change the way it's structured because someone's panicking because they incorrectly believe that sexual assault is rampant in the military. I mean, we got to think about what is the response that Congress is expecting, and when they're doing things like changing the criminal justice system out of a misplaced belief that things are much worse in the military than they are, that's a mistake. As for the notion that it's nitpicking to make a distinction between forcible rape and buttock slapping, I don't think that's nitpicking at all. We used to execute people for rape, and maybe we should still execute people for rape when we're talking about forcible rape. But there is a giant difference between one end of the spectrum on unwanted sexual contact and the other end of the spectrum. Those are big, big, big differences. And the problem with a term like a sexual assault is that people hear it in the newspapers and they think that we're talking about rape. And we should be very clear about what we're talking about. I think it's true that having a higher standard than the military, and by the way, adultery is a punishable offense in the military. And they do, in fact, punish it. So they do hold people to a higher standard, and I think rightly so. But there's a point in which you are going so far to where people who are essentially not guilty of any offense are being treated as criminals, and that's a big mistake. There was a case involving a staff sergeant a few years ago. He and a woman who was in the military, I don't recall what her rank was, they were both married. They went to a drugstore and picked up some condoms. They checked into a hotel together. They were watching television for a while, having a bit to drink. And at some point, there was sexual intercourse. Originally, they were, in fact, charged with adultery. And then the female in the couple, I believe, went to sexual harassment training and learned that after one drink, her consent doesn't count. And she changed her story to the notion that she was just lying there on the bed doing nothing, and the guy just jumped on her. He eventually was prosecuted for aggravated sexual assault, though he was found innocent. The charges for adultery against her were dropped at that point. So there's perceived to be an unfairness, and I think there's perceived to be an unfairness because there is an unfairness going on here. That, of course, is just one anecdote, but that should make you worry. Again, though, I agree with your basic premise.
And do you think that there should be some changes in the justice system in the military? And if so, what? Or just something that stops short of the overhaul that you think is unwarranted?
I believe that as someone who knows about this much about the military systems, criminal justice system, that I should stay out of that issue. But what I will say is this. If changes are needed, they shouldn't be driven by the misplaced belief that somehow the military is a place of where sexual violence is part of the culture. And that's what's worrying me, that this is being driven by panic instead of by good, solid thinking about what should be the military justice system and what shouldn't be. Ordinarily I would say that a system that develops over time does so for a reason. There's a reason the military criminal justice system is different from the civilian one. There are very different things going on there. But things change. Communications have changed, for example. And part of the reason for the military's criminal justice system was the fact that sometimes you've got people committing crimes out on the battlefield. You got to deal with it quickly. You got to deal with it in a way that's consistent with what the military is there to do. And, to some extent, with different transportation, different communications, things can change. But don't let it be driven by misinformation. That's all I'm asking.
Lara, Diana, does the military different enough that what works in the civilian world doesn't work for it?
That's a broad statement, and I don't know the answer to that, but I will say that the Gillibrand bill that we're talking about was not overhauling the entire criminal justice system. I know in particular the main focus of the bill was taking the decision whether to prosecute out of the chain of command. So, and that wasn't just driven by the fact that there's a perceived sexual assault problem in the military. It was driven by the fact that lots and lots of women were that justice wasn't being served because women were not feeling like they could report what happened to them to their commander, that they were forced to serve alongside their attacker because it was swept under the rug because the person who runs the unit was deciding whether or not this should be prosecuted rather than a neutral third party. So that is what it was, those changes were being driven by.
Diana, do you have any?
Well, we've had a couple of decades of women in the military, and maybe it is time to rethink and consider having men's units and women's units and keeping them more separate, and then that could solve some of these problems, such as Lara described about women being afraid to go to the bathroom alone in the middle of the night.
Gail.
I just wanted to say that the big difference that's being focused on between the civilian and the civilian criminal system and the military criminal system is the notion that the military is very commanding officer focused. It is the commanding officer who has the ultimate responsibility to make sure justice is done. And that's what the Gillibrand bill does. It takes that commanding officer focused system and replaces it with prosecutors from way outside to deal with problems, and that is a fundamental change in the military system. And that is the big difference that people cite between military and civilian justice, this notion of having the commanding officer being responsible for making sure that justice is done.
Let me ask you, I did a little reading last night in preparation for this to try to get my hands better on this subject of pay equity, and I have to tell you it made my head spin because for every study I read that said one thing, I read another study that seemed to say the opposite thing. But one thing that I read, and I think I heard all of you say, and so I'd be interested in what you think the reasons are or if you even think it's a problem, is that women and men starting out in their first jobs, women make less money than men do, even if they have same educational background and they're going into the same fields. Now, maybe you'll dispute that study that I read, I don't know. But is that an issue? And if so, it would seem like it would have to be explained by more than Yale law students, for instance, who would have, really have their pick probably of places to go to work. Most people, I think, well, especially now, are lucky to get a job. So do you agree that that is correct, that women start out at less than men? And if so, why do you think that is?
So I think you're reading the AAUW, American Association of University Women study, probably.
It was something that had an initial and an abbreviation, I do know that.
Right, exactly, yes. And they get that result with broad fields and broad occupations. So if you compare women and men in a particular occupation, and you see that male graduates are paid more than female graduates. One reason is because every occupation is made up of a lot of different kinds of jobs. Also, so within the occupation of finance, for example, I mean, there could be real estate agents, there could be investment bankers, there is a very broad range. If you find more men going into investment banking and more women going into real estate, then you have that discrepancy. The only way to prove discrimination is to look at two people in the same firm, two entry-level supermarket cashiers, two entry-level associates in a law firm. When you do that, you find that at the entry level, they get paid the same. If they're not, they can sue. But it is very difficult for an employer to hire a man and a woman doing the same job and pay them differently. So that study gets the result by using occupational data. And that result is not a surprising result, because men and women choose different jobs and different industries within a particular occupation.
Laura, what do you say?
I say that it certainly can happen, and I'm sure it does. I think there are a lot of companies and a lot of employers that would pay women less than men for the same reason that it's been happening for decades. And I think when they're starting out is no exception. So, yeah, I think that that's right, and I think that there are stories we know of where women start out at less and continue to earn less. It actually becomes more pronounced as they progress through their careers. That's what the statistics show. And that their pay increases as they go along are less because they start out at less, and so they end up way behind by the end.
Yeah.
I wanted to agree with Laura on the point that in fact, the gap gets larger as time goes by. So actually, the entry level is when it's at its tiniest. Yeah. You get a very, very small gap there. Again, we're dealing with aggregate data. When you're dealing with aggregate data, it's not like every job is the same. They're not the same. They're in broad categories. But at these entry levels, that's where you get almost insignificant.
And the reason it widens is because as women have children, they prefer to spend more time with family, and they tend to cut back their hours. You've all seen women in the workplace complain that they have to travel rather than be happy about the travel opportunities, and they say, I don't want to leave, I don't want to be, take time away from my kids. You hear this very commonly in workplaces, and that women try to get home earlier. And whether it's a social construct or whether it's a choice, I say it's a choice. Lara might say, and other people have said to me that it's a social construct. That different apportionment of hours is one reason that as time goes on, men's and women's wages differ.
Go ahead.
I would say to that we're talking about a very small subset of women who are complaining about traveling at work. I think that we're talking about Yale Law women, we're talking about a very privileged set of women, and I think that's a gross overgeneralization. Some women may want to travel, but they don't feel like they have a spouse who's supportive, who has flexibility at his job to be able to pitch in. They may not feel like they have childcare coverage when they need it. There's a lot of reasons why one woman might not want to travel, other women may want to travel. I think that's just too much of a generalization. But also, let's talk about low-wage workers for a moment, because women make up 2/3 of low-wage workers, and that's those who earn minimum wage or less. And for them, the reality is quite different, and they may not be traveling for work, but they don't have a choice about what sort of finding a job that has more flexibility or doesn't have more flexibility. So I think it's a different picture.
Well, here we're talking about an even smaller group of women, because there are only 3% of women who make minimum wage or less. 3% of American workers, make minimum wage or less. And 62% of that group is women, so that's 2% of the American workforce. So we're talking about an even smaller group.
Gail, you wanted to say something?
I want to just add a couple of more facts here. I don't think we're talking about just a group of very elite women here that don't want to travel, but rather it's often things like, I need a job where I can be flexible enough to take my child to the dentist appointment at 9:15. So I need a job where I can get to work at 10:15 instead of 9 o'clock on some days. That's a very large swath of women, and very often people pick their jobs based on wanting to have that flexibility. One interesting thing you'll see is that the wage gap gets larger and larger as time goes on. So women in their 30s, larger gap than you'd get for 20s, 40s, larger. But right about the time that juniors, finally go off to college, the wage gap turns around and starts going back together again, just what you would expect if this is largely a question of the need for flexibility for childcare. Now, it's true that we can make arguments about whether this is a social construct, whether women are forced to be the primary caregivers for children. Certainly, single mothers don't have a choice. But what I would submit is, that's an interesting problem, but no law makes that the problem of the employer. The employer has a duty to get the job done. They've got to run the store, they've got to run the office or whatever it is. And the law does not require them to supply the child care. So if there's a problem here, it's not a problem that's been created by the employer.
Laura, I wanted to...
Plus, you can for single men and women between 25 and 35, the wage gap reverses itself. Women make about $1.10 or $1.14 on the man's dollar. This is not a problem of discrimination against women per se. Otherwise, we would see the same lower wage for women in that age group too for those singles. It's a problem of when, and I don't see it as a problem, it's a choice of where women with families enter the workforce, they choose lower paying jobs with more flexibility. That's not a social problem that the government needs to address.
Laura, could you address that? What exactly should be done? Because let's say that your version of the studies is correct. There's an Equal Pay Act already. There are laws against gender discrimination. What else could be done that would take care of this gap or should be done?
Okay, there are several things that I would suggest. What the Equal Pay Act would do, what the Paycheck Fairness Act would do, would be to amend the Equal Pay Act. Even though the Equal Pay Act has been in place since 1963, it's outdated and it's in need of updating. It would, the Paycheck Fairness Act would prohibit employers from retaliating against workers who discuss their pay with coworkers. That's something they should have the freedom to do, and currently it's not prohibited, and lots of employers will not allow workers to discuss their pay, and that is one way that they're able to hide discrimination. That was the case for Lily Ledbetter, who worked for Goodyear Tire for decades and never knew that she was paid less than the men who were doing the same exact managerial job she was doing until an anonymous tip showed up in her mailbox towards the end of her career. The law would also close big loopholes in employer defenses to equal pay claims. As Gail said, it would collect information about pay in order to identify patterns of discrimination to improve enforcement of the laws. It would do other things to make enforcement of the law better and give employers more of an incentive to stop discriminating. Because again, businesses that say that the Paycheck Fairness Act is bad for business really just don't want any oversight. What they want is, if they don't discriminate, they won't have a legal problem. And so that is one thing. And then the other things, I would say we need to raise the minimum wage and the tipped minimum wage, because that will help lift the wages of women in low-wage jobs. We need to build more entry ramps for women into high-wage jobs, remove the barriers for entry into those male-dominated fields, make sure they get the education and training that they need to be qualified for those jobs, increase the availability of high-quality, affordable childcare, and help address caregiver discrimination.
Gail, Diana, have at it. What's the worst of those ideas?
What's the worst of those particular ideas?
Yes.
The worst one, I think, is the minimum wage one, but that's my own view. That if you want to have more people unemployed, an excellent way of doing it is to raise the minimum wage. So that would be the worst idea of the immediate side of that. One problem we've got is that basically what is being pushed for here with the Pay Equity Act is the ability to sue and to say, I'm not getting paid as much as so-and-so in this category, and to have employers have to set their wages in ways that can be justified to a jury that doesn't understand their business. They want to get to the point where they can say, well, this job requires 4 years of college education, and so does that one. Why aren't they paid the same? Well, because the jobs aren't exactly the same. They're different jobs. And if you paint employers into a corner where they have to be able to explain exactly why one job pays as much as it does and another one as much as it does, beyond the simple supply and demand, then we're going to become a very bureaucratic economy that cannot compete abroad.
Diana?
Yes, it's interesting that Lara talked about increasing opportunities for high-wage women to get into high-paying jobs at the same time as raising the minimum wage, because we already have the situation where with a $7.25 minimum wage and you add Social Security, unemployment insurance, workers' comp, it costs an employer about $8 an hour. So you have to have skills of $8 an hour in order to be able to work in the United States. Raising the minimum wage to $10.10, or as some have called for, $15 an hour, that means you have to have skills of about $11 an hour, or you have to have skills of $16.50 an hour in order to be permitted to work in the United States. This is a great disincentive for low-skill women. It prevents low-skill women from getting their foot on the first rung of the career ladder. And I would agree with Gail about the enforcement issues. There are many examples of companies. Take Exxon, for example, that has a group of men doing work in oil exploration and development. Men working on oil rigs, women in office jobs. And on the face of it, you might look at those two groups and say, well, they should be paid the same. And you can imagine the EEOC or the Department of Labor looking and calling in Exxon saying, why don't you pay those two the same? One is more dangerous and dirty. And these factors, these risk factors, are not taken into account in many of these comparable worth analyses where they talk about how much individuals should be paid. So I would argue for less government intrusion in the workplace. And people are always free to change jobs if they don't think they're getting paid enough. Most people, by the way, think that they are underpaid.
I just want to add that the Paycheck Fairness Act does have exceptions for, lots of exceptions for business-related reasons for paying different jobs differently. What we're talking about is a big loophole that currently exists, which is right now employers can choose to pay two workers differently because of a quote-unquote factor other than sex, which is very broad. You could drive a truck through it, and a lot of courts have interpreted that, very leniently, and so it's basically anything the employer can think of, any sort of reason why. And what we're trying to do through the Paycheck Fairness Act is to close that loophole. That's all. There are still exceptions so that employers will not, have to pay differently situated jobs differently.
Gail, I wanted to ask you, I suppose in a way a lot of this is anecdotal, and now I'm talking about what you talked about with sexual assaults on campus or in the military. But I have to say that the impression that I've gotten is that universities don't move fast enough to take care of these cases, that in the cases of, say, star athletes, not very much is done, or a very thorough investigation is conducted, or that in even small colleges where that's not the issue, that colleges are very uncomfortable dealing with this subject matter, and they don't thoroughly investigate credible claims that women bring forward. Can you talk about that? Am I wrong?
First of all, I would think that it's generally the province of the police to deal with rape and sexual assault, and not with colleges and universities. So I'm not surprised that they're not particularly good at dealing with it. They're not particularly good at dealing with any other kind of crime either. But my point is simply that we have gotten ourselves to a point where the situation is so overstated that instead of that being helpful to setting policy, it's hurtful. We're sending a message to female students that they're not safe, and it's not true. Sure, there's crime out there, and there's, again, as I've said before, there's probably more unwanted sexual contact on campuses than there is in nursing homes. I mean, that would be the other extreme. And most institutions involving full-time employed people are somewhere in between. But it's not doing women any favor to overstate it, and that's my point.
I don't think that a lot of parents would be comfortable sending their daughters off to college if they believed that 20% of them, or that they had a 20% chance of getting raped at university. You wouldn't find students so anxious to go to university and so anxious to sign up for co-ed dorms and co-ed bathrooms. And by the way, on campuses, there is no push for single-sex dorms, single-sex bathrooms. All the push is the other way. So this is really, the statistics from the CDC are grossly exaggerated. And the problem appears to be drinking and then being involved in actions that you then repent afterwards. And we haven't talked, by the way, about the process for young men who are accused of rape and the evidence required of them. And Gail can talk about it better than I. But young men can be convicted on the basis of hearsay, very flimsy evidence. They can be suspended. Their whole plans to go to law school can be put on hold by this. We also need to pay attention to the rights of the accused. And I would agree that this is a matter for state and local police rather than for college administrative systems.
I'm almost positive Laura has something to say about this, but before she does, I'm going to invite anyone who has a question or comment to come to one of the microphones, and you folks will take over from here. Go ahead, Laura.
The key word that you used a moment ago was convicted. We're not talking about conviction in a court of law. We're talking about a school disciplinary proceeding. And so the safeguards do not have to be the same that they are in a court of law. Before that, you mentioned parents, in the face of evidence that 1/5 of young college women are being raped, deciding not to send their daughters to college at all. I think that's not
That's what happened to my
realistic.
grandmother.
Well, right, But today, that's not happening, and it's not because
it's not because it's not true.
It's not because it's not true. It's because no one thinks it's going to happen to them until it happens to them. People smoke. They know there's a high risk of cancer, and until they get lung cancer, they think it's not going to happen to them. And the same is true with getting raped, and the same is true with a lot of things. But to suggest that parents, in the face of this evidence, which is true, should instead just keep their daughters home is ludicrous. And I don't think, and that's the whole point. They shouldn't have to forego educational opportunities just because there's a risk of getting raped.
If we really had an incidence of rape of 16.6% on campuses, it would be ludicrous for parents to send their kids to college, because that's just, that would be through the roof. That would be like the worst thing you could imagine. You say that, well, people don't think it's going to happen to them, and you use the example of cigarette smoking. Well, duh, lots of people don't smoke for precisely that reason. I don't see how you can say that women are not being affected by these exaggerated numbers. There are people out there who actually believe this stuff, and they're almost certain, unless they're complete fools, to take some sort of action that in fact was unnecessary. Maybe it will be something like, well, I don't want to go to college, I don't want to live on campus, I'll live at home, I'll go to the college here that's in my town, and I'll live at my mom's house. Or they might do all sorts of other things. And we're not doing young women any favors to suggest to them that the dangers are much greater than they in fact are. And use of terms like sexual assault, when in fact we mean things that are much less than rape, massively less than rape,
Well, we're talking
is
hold
really
on.
a very
Hold
big
on,
mistake.
I'm going to try to get to some questions.
My name is Sharon Bogata. Can you hear me?
Can't hear you.
Yes.
I just have a quick comment and then a question. I was lucky enough to attend a forum with women in the military, a woman general and admiral, and a lot of the women that joined the military were explaining we don't want to be considered victims. That's some of the reasons why these the issues have come up. And that's something that a forum like this would be fantastic if we could get one of those women and explain the military culture, because I too am trying to understand it. At the same time, I attended forums about the college rape culture. It was interesting because the parents always are worried because the pendulum is swinging too far.
The front floor mic,
One of the parents actually said they wanted to have their son videotape any sexual encounter he did have
Oh.
because of the alcohol issue with the alcohol consumption. And that scares some of the parents. Yet sexual assault is real, it is a problem. So during this time I was staying in a Hyatt, and they actually told me when I checked in that they were putting me on the female-only floor. And I was like, you gotta be kidding me, because I'm a voice of the modern, I'm a feminist. And I was like, okay, I'm
this
gonna
one
be
right
a guy to my relationship, and they're like, no, it's women only, you've got a female room service attendant. Everybody on the floor for their surveillance will be a female. And it was so the female customers would feel a little bit more comfortable. The second day, I loved it. I could go get ice. I didn't have to think about, can I run out of the room real quick? And so maybe some of your points are very valid. So I want to thank you for having the diversity of thought. And I am a voice of a modern. I think there's always something in the middle. And I think all of you have great points. Thank you.
It's interesting. Does female-only dorms doesn't seem to me like that could be the answer, but maybe it is. I know I couldn't get my daughter to probably stay in one, but
Well, apparently the major problem is the alcohol, so female-only dorms are not the solution, I have been told. But I would just like to follow up on the point about young men that you made. Claire McCaskill commissioned a study, which is on her website, Senator Claire McCaskill. She commissioned it in July. It has an appendix that shows what schools do to when it comes to these disciplinary these hearings, and 95% of the institutions use suspension or use expulsion for these young men. Very few of them have strong proof of evidence, as would be heard in a court of law that all of you are much more familiar with than I am. And even though it's just a student disciplinary procedure, if it's on a young man's record, they can't get into medical school, they can't get into law school. These are very serious consequences.
Okay, I'm going to alternate microphones, so we'll go to the back.
Hello. Oh, this is loud. Jim Wass, a business process analyst and struggling 1L. Laura, you were talking about the Paycheck Fairness Act. Diana used an old term that I'm more familiar with, the comparable worth. And I take things to extreme ends. What keeps this from tending toward a federal pay scale for private sector payment, salaries?
It's not what it is, and it's not a comparable worth statute either. I mean, it's not, that's not what this bill would address. So I think that's just a misunderstanding.
But does it force companies to justify what they pay? I mean, isn't that in a way the same thing?
Right. It gives the government permission to look at the books of companies, to look
yes.
at the race, the sex, the pay of the different groups, and if they think that there is a difference that is not justified, they can ask the company to correct it.
Yes.
Now the question is, how are they going to decide? And the way they usually decide are these comparable worth measures. You can call them whatever you want, but the government is going to be using some measure to say, is this pay structure fair and equitable? Does it comply with the law or not?
Yes, but there is a role for the federal government to play in enforcement of civil rights laws that is not equivalent to the government creating a pay scale and saying all private employers must pay X, Y, Z. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about where there's a pattern of disparities, doing an investigation into why that is and trying to determine whether it's attributable to discrimination. That's completely different from a federal pay scale for the private sector.
Gail, do you have anything?
I think the key word was tending toward, and I think there's no doubt in the world that it tends towards that.
Well, the bill did not pass in a Democratic House, Democratic Senate with Democratic presidents, so it's unlikely to pass in the next couple of years.
By the way, there was also another bill sponsored by Senator Harkin that was basically traditional comparable worth. President Obama endorsed both.
Sir, you're up.
Hi. Thank you for all. It was a very interesting discussion. Appreciate that. I have a question for two of the panelists. Gail first. These sexual assaults in the military, do they typically happen on submarines or ships or things of very close quarters?
I've been on a submarine. They're too small for any of that.
What's that?
I've been on a submarine. They're too small for any of that.
Okay. Well,
I agree. I've been on one too.
right. Because Diana touched on something. It may be the way to handle this is to sort of head this stuff off. Kind of your dorm example, all feet on the, toes on the floor, because I mean, we don't want to come to a place where we accept a certain amount of sexual assault, but I think there's a bit of human nature. You have men and women in close quarters and hormones, and you're off isolated. Bad things will happen. I just think we just should be adults and try to accept that it could be a recipe for disaster. So it might be a good idea. Do you think it's a good idea to really try to separate the sexes to the extent possible?
I haven't really thought about it. I think that, there's an argument for that. I actually was thinking of it more in terms of the campus stuff instead of the military, in that, more rules that are more like the rules that existed prior to the 1960s. I can imagine some schools being interested in that and some high school students wanting to apply to a school like that. I don't think that there's enough desire for that for every school to do it. But I think there ought to be schools that can do it. And one of the things that bothers me about the Department of Education's approach to this is that, when they issue a guidance, it applies to every school. So they basically all have to handle the problem the same way. And that way that they've selected is by establishing a giant bureaucracy whose job it is just to deal with that one problem. And I think that's a problem in itself, to treat sexual assault, if we want to go that far, or unwanted sexual attention, whatever, to have an entire bureaucracy devoted to that. They will be determined to find it whether it's there or not, so that kind of worries me. But the military issue, the notion of separate companies and such, I haven't given enough thought to that.
To the extent possible.
Yeah, but I have general sympathy for the notion of when you're in close quarters with people, they're going to be friendly that way.
And you had another quick one?
I do. For Lara. I guess you had mentioned that there are women over the course of your remarks, you said that women are excluded from certain professions. I know that was true well before I was born, but I didn't think that was true in the last quarter century. I'm not sure if you walked that back or not, but also part of the pay disparity is, I think, is choice. When I go visit the dentist, the receptionist is always a woman. That's been the case, for the last 40 years, and I do think that they typically make less than the dentists make. So we see that, when you guys talked about certain high-risk professions like, mining and, building buildings, things like that. I mean, do you think there should be a premium paid to recognize for danger in certain professions that also happen to be dominated by men?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with paying certain jobs that require risk higher than jobs that don't require risk. That's not what I'm saying. And, in terms of women being excluded from certain professions, it may not be as obvious as it was decades ago, where it was maybe even, women need not apply for certain professions, but I think that the fact is there are some professions where women are still not hired or not hired in any significant numbers. But in terms of your point about paying different occupations differently, that's fine. I don't expect that a receptionist would make the same thing as the dentist. But the fact that the receptionist has always been a woman is not just because she's, only a woman would want to be a receptionist, but for many, many decades, so only those types of jobs were open to women. And it's only in recent history that women are able to go to dental school and become dentists. So I think we're still dealing with the vestiges of that to some extent.
Well, the graduates of dental schools, it's about 50% women for law schools.
Now it is.
Also now. So I think that the remaining discrepancies we have are, as I said before, a matter of choice. I looked at when Lara mentioned about sexual harassment for women who wanted to major in engineering or STEM. So I looked at the percent of physics, chemistry, engineering majors at some single-sex schools, such as Smith and Barnard, and it was not, and Bryn Mawr, and it was not any higher. In fact, it was lower than at some co-ed colleges. So it's not as though women at these single-sex colleges have a higher proportion that are majoring in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics,
We're
which
running out of
suggests that
time,
they are
so
not being driven away.
I'm going to go fast. To the gentleman in the back.
Yes, this is for anyone on the panel or everyone on the panel. I'm astounded at the lousy data you're working with. That the best information on unwanted sexual contact in the military and on campuses, no one can agree on how to measure it and what to measure. Similar problems with unequal wages when you're looking at different jobs. In almost every area of public policy, pollsters and surveyors and scientists get data that are comparable so that they can get good information. Here you are giving presentations authoritatively on these subjects, and you're talking about different numbers, meaning different things. Why is the data so bad?
So there are different data sources. So we were talking about the Center for Disease Control study on sexual assault, and I compared it with the Bureau of Justice Statistics.
Yes,
from the
no, I
Department of
understand that. What
Justice
I'm saying
show
is,
very different
why
things.
can't someone do studies that address the policy issues? I'm a journalist, and all of the numbers that are being cited on both sides strike me as the equivalent of getting a candidate's in-house poll the week before the election. Somebody's trying to pull something off here. Surely reasonable numbers can be gathered that reasonable people can agree that's the way to look at that problem, and then you measure it. But you're all using numbers that are flawed and contradicting them, contradicting each other, and pointing out the flaws in those numbers. Why can't someone come up with acceptable numbers?
Well, the CDC produced the study, and there are many things wrong with it. And so when someone produces a study that has flaws, such as the American Association of University Women's study on women versus men taking their first jobs. I mean, you can look at how the study is done, and you can see why there are these differences. And so we've been mentioning why some of these are caused. So the question is, why do these studies come out in the first place? Well, there are some groups that have an incentive to have intrusive government policies.
I
So they
understand. Why
produce
does no one
weak
have an
studies.
incentive to coming up with straight data?
Right. You're looking for the one-handed economist, right?
Well, the Bureau, the Justice Department does produce straight data, and I quoted it, and it's on the Justice Department website for any of you who want to look at it.
Okay, thank you. You've got our last question.
I read an interesting thought experiment, which was someone suggested that if, in fact, the difference between the pay of men and women is due to just pure discrimination and not due to a difference in situations and qualifications, how come some enterprising, Carl Icahn hasn't taken over a company and fired all the men, or at least hired only women at that point, thereby saving 1/4 of the payroll, which would be an enormous savings? Or how come companies haven't arisen where the hires tend to be women because the market rates allow such an enormous saving? And I guess the question is, isn't the fact that we haven't seen that some indication that the differences in pay reflect something real and not just discrimination?
I don't think so. I think the reason you don't see all women is because there's still sex discrimination, and there is this perception, for example, that mothers don't work as hard as fathers. I mean, I think that's still very real, and I don't think that holds up.
Well, so the question, the question is, if this is just discrimination, then someone could undercut that
Right.
and have a law firm with just
Right. I hear you.
women, and then scoop up all the business because the cost would be lower.
But the reason they don't do that, I'm saying, is because most businesses are still run by men, and they don't make those decisions because they don't see, even with a, I mean, it's just,
Yeah,
it's
but there
just
could be
silly.
a-
But you only need
It's-
one.
I mean,
You only
there
need one.
could be a
to-
women-owned firm, for example, that
Right,
would do that.
but
Carl Icahn is discriminatory?
it's just, it's,
They have
I-
to all be that way for your point to be valid.
I actually-
One can go in and be the one that undercuts and makes a bundle because they hire only women. Interestingly.
I actually did hear of someone who did start a law firm who explained to me that he did hire these women with children, and he was able to give them flexible hours, and he was able to run his law firm at a lower cost. But I won't give you the name of this gentleman because he still has his law firm in Washington.
Historically, the great case is Jewish law firms in New York. During the 1920s and 30s, there was, an understood good old boy, we don't hire Jewish lawyers. And a number of the most prosperous law firms today were the ones that were founded when Jewish lawyers got together and thought, well, let's have our own firm. And indeed, they did prosper. They were discriminated against, and the market did exactly what you'd expect it to do. In the end, the firms that discriminated, a lot of those firms aren't with us anymore. But the firms that were formed in order to combat that discrimination prospered.
Well, and some people might say that's why school teachers are underpaid, right? Because it is a largely female workforce.
right.
I guess we'll let that be the final word. I wanted to take the microphone here and just thank the audience for coming today and sticking out the whole day. I want to thank our panelists today, and especially Bob Barnes for moderating. And I want to thank our co-hosts, the Federalist Society, Cato, and Heritage as well. But please join me in thanking our panel.